The evening sun cast long shadows over the hills of Galilee, painting the land in shades of gold and amber. The breeze whispered through the olive trees, yet even the beauty of the landscape could not lift the heavy hearts of the small group gathered around Jesus. Silence hung over them, broken only by the occasional rustle of the leaves and the faint call of birds heading to their nests. Grief had settled upon the disciples like a thick fog, blurring their senses, numbing their hearts. They had lost one of their own, a brother, a companion, someone who had walked with them through joy and sorrow alike. His absence now felt like an open wound, and each disciple carried their own share of the pain, uncertain how to move forward in the face of such loss. Peter, known for his boldness, sat with his shoulders slumped, staring at the ground. His heart was a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, anger, sadness, all swirling together in a storm that he did not know how to navigate. He had always been the first to speak, the first to act, but now words failed him. He could not shake the thought that somehow he could have done something to prevent this loss. If only he had been more watchful, more prayerful, more attentive. His mind replayed every interaction, every moment, searching for where things might have gone wrong. Beside him, John, the disciple who had always been closest to Jesus, wept silently. His tears fell softly into the dirt, each one a testament to the depth of his sorrow. John had loved their departed brother like family. They had shared countless meals, countless conversations, countless prayers. And now all of that was gone. The ache in John's chest was deep, and though he knew in his heart that death was not the end, it did not lessen the sting of loss. He missed his friend, missed the sound of his voice, missed the way they used to laugh together. Mary sat a little apart from the others, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She had always been the one to offer comfort, to ease the burdens of others with her kind words and gentle presence. But now she found herself at a loss. How could she comfort the others when her own heart was so heavy? How could she find words when she herself felt like a ship adrift on a stormy sea, with no anchor to hold her steady? Mary closed her eyes, willing the tears to stay hidden, but they came anyway, slipping down her cheeks like rain. Thomas, who often wrestled with doubt, sat with his arms crossed, his brow furrowed. He wanted to believe that there was a purpose to all of this, that somehow their friend's death was part of a larger plan, but it was hard to see it. His mind was full of questions, questions that gnawed at him relentlessly. Why had God allowed this to happen? Why had their friend been taken from them? Was this the cost of following Jesus? Endless heartache and loss? Thomas shook his head, trying to silence the doubts, but they only grew louder. Jesus, seated in the center of the circle, looked around at his disciples. His heart ached for them. He could see the sorrow etched into each of their faces, could feel the weight of their grief pressing down on their spirits. He knew their pain intimately, for he had walked through the valley of grief himself. He had lost friends, had seen the suffering of his people, and knew that even though they followed him, they were not immune to the trials of this world. For a long time Jesus said nothing. He simply sat with them, allowing the silence to speak. He knew that sometimes words were not enough, that in moments of deep sorrow, presence mattered more than anything. And so, he was present with them, fully and completely sharing in their grief. After what felt like an eternity, Jesus finally spoke. His voice was soft, gentle, like a lullaby meant to soothe a troubled soul. The disciples looked up at him, their eyes filled with questions, with longing, with a need for comfort. "My dear friends," Jesus began, his gaze moving from one disciple to the next. "I know your hearts are heavy. I can feel the sorrow that weighs upon you, the grief that has taken root in your souls. And I want you to know that it is okay to feel this way. Grief is not something to be ashamed of. It is the natural response to love, to the loss of someone who mattered deeply to you." The disciples listened intently, hanging on his every word. Even in their pain, there was something about Jesus' voice that brought a measure of peace, a sense that they were not alone in their suffering. "I want to tell you a story," Jesus continued. "It is a story about loss and love, about grief and hope. The disciples leaned in, eager to hear the wisdom that they knew would follow. Once, in a village not far from here, Jesus began, there lived a shepherd. He was a man of simple means, but his heart was rich with love for his flock. Every morning he would rise early and lead his sheep to the fields, where they would graze on the soft, green grass and drink from the clear waters of the stream. The shepherd knew each of his sheep by name, and they trusted him completely. Wherever he led, they followed, for they knew that he would protect them. As Jesus spoke, the disciples could almost see the shepherd in their minds. They could picture him walking through the fields, his staff in hand, his eyes scanning the horizon as he watched over his flock. There was a tenderness in the way Jesus described the shepherd, a deep sense of care that resonated with the disciples' own longing for comfort. But one day, Jesus continued, as the sun was setting and the shepherd was preparing to lead his flock back to the safety of the pen, he realized that one of his sheep was missing. A young lamb, full of curiosity and energy, had wandered off. The shepherd's heart sank with worry, for he knew that the hills could be dangerous at night. There were predators that roamed the wilderness, and the lamb was vulnerable. The disciples felt a pang of anxiety as they imagined the lost lamb, alone in the wilderness. It reminded them of their own feelings of abandonment, their sense of being lost in the midst of their grief. The shepherd did not hesitate, Jesus said. He left the 99 sheep in the safety of the pen and set out in search of the one that was lost. The hills were steep and the paths were treacherous, but the shepherd was determined. He called out the lamb's name again and again, his voice echoing through the valleys, but there was no answer. Peter clenched his fists, his heart racing as he imagined the shepherd's desperate search. He could feel the shepherd's fear, the overwhelming need to find the lamb before it was too late. It reminded him of the times he had felt lost, wandering through his own doubts and fears, unsure if he would ever find his way back. As the night grew darker, Jesus continued, the shepherd's worry grew. The wind howled through the mountains and the cold air bit at his skin, but still he pressed on. His love for the lamb was greater than his fear, greater than his weariness. He could not bear the thought of losing even one of his flock. The disciples were silent, their hearts gripped by the intensity of the story. They could feel the shepherd's love, his unwavering commitment to finding the lamb, no matter the cost. Finally, Jesus said softly, after hours of searching, the shepherd heard a faint bleat in the distance. His heart leaped with hope and he followed the sound, running as fast as he could. And there, caught in a narrow ravine, was the lamb. It was weak and frightened, its wool torn from the thorns, and it was too scared to move. John wiped away a tear as he imagined the lamb, its small body trembling in fear. He understood that fear, the feeling of being trapped in a situation with no way out, the fear that perhaps no one would come to save you. The shepherd knelt beside the lamb. Jesus said, his voice full of emotion, and without hesitation he reached out and lifted it into his arms. The lamb was frightened at first, but as soon as it felt the warmth of the shepherd's embrace, it knew that it was safe. The shepherd held the lamb close to his chest, whispering words of comfort as he carried it back home. The disciples were overcome with emotion. They could almost feel the shepherd's love, the way he cradled the lamb with tenderness and care. It was a love that spoke to their deepest need, the need to be held in the midst of their pain, to know that they were not alone in their suffering. But the story does not end there, Jesus said. When the shepherd returned to the village, he called out to his friends and neighbors, saying, "Rejoice with me, for I have found my lost lamb." And together they celebrated, for what was lost had been found. Tears flowed freely now from the disciples' eyes. They had been lost in their grief, lost in their sorrow, but now they understood that they were not truly alone. Just as the shepherd had searched for the lamb, so too would their Father in heaven search for them in their moments of despair. Jesus looked at each of his disciples, his eyes full of love. "My beloved ones," he said gently, "grief is like that lost lamb. It takes us away from the safety of the flock, leaving us feeling abandoned and alone. But just as the shepherd searched tirelessly for his lamb, so does our Father search for us in our grief. He finds us even when we feel most lost and carries us back to the safety of His love. The disciples wept not out of sorrow but out of a sense of release. Their grief was still there, but it no longer felt like a burden they had to carry alone. They knew now that they were held in love, a love that would never leave them, a love that would always find them no matter how far they wandered. Grief is a part of life, Jesus said softly. It is the price we pay for love. But it is not the end of the story. Just as the shepherd rejoiced when he found his lost lamb, so too will your Father in heaven rejoice when you are found in the midst of your grief. And you will be found, my friends. You will be found. At that moment the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the hills in a soft glow. The disciples felt a warmth inside their hearts, a glimmer of hope amidst their sorrow. Remember, Jesus said, His voice tender and full of love, grief does not define you. Love does. And love, like the shepherd's care for his lamb, will always bring you home. The disciples rose slowly, their hearts lighter than they had been in days. They still felt the weight of their loss, but now they carried it differently. They knew that they were not alone in their grief, that they were held by a love greater than anything they could comprehend. As they walked back to the village, the stars began to twinkle in the sky above them, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, light remains. And in that light they found hope. This is end of the story. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.